Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is a crime action from 2004 titled Walking Tall. The movie begins with Chris, a former army surgeon, who resigns from his position due to concerns about the lack of time spent with his family. Deciding to return home, Chris embarks on his journey. However, upon his arrival, he is shocked by the significant changes in his hometown. He sees kids playing in the streets, a group of women excessively drinking in an alley, and a once operational factory now closed. These changes paint a picture of a town that has transformed dramatically since Chris's departure. While on his journey, Chris runs into Sheriff Watkins, his neighbor. The sheriff suggests they head home together, and Chris agrees. Finally, Chris arrives at his parents' house and receives a warm welcome from his older sister Michelle, a police officer. His mom and dad are overjoyed to see him after 8 years. They have dinner, and Chris meets his nephew Pete. Pete is curious about Chris being a soldier and asks if he's ever killed anyone. Later, in Pete's room, the question comes up again about whether Chris has ever killed someone, but Chris doesn't answer. The next day, while fixing his house's stairs, Chris's childhood friend Ray hears about his return and takes him to their old playing field. There, Chris reunites with old friends, including Jay, who's now rich and owns a closed factory turned casino. They play football, and Pete, Chris's nephew, joins, casually smoking marijuana with his friends. The match starts exciting, but Jay's team, filled with arrogant kids, plays rough to win. After the match, Jay invites Chris and friends to his casino to celebrate. That night, they arrive, and Jay gives them money to play games. Chris's friends are eager to gamble, leaving him behind since he prefers watching dancers. One performer makes Chris nervous. The dancer, Chris's friend Deanie, can't see outside her mirrored room, but Chris can see her. Surprisingly, she recognizes Chris, turns on the light, and is shocked to see him, leading to a quick and embarrassed exit. After that, Chris meets Jimmy, who's playing a dice game. Jimmy bets $100 on rolling a 6, but Chris senses something odd and challenges Jimmy to roll the dice. Jimmy insists on throwing them, and it unexpectedly turns out to be a 7. Chris, feeling emotional, protests against the gamblers, wanting to bet that the dice will show the number 7. The dealer objects, but Chris insists and throws the dice, landing on 7 to everyone's surprise. Soon after, Chris demands his money back, but he is abruptly apprehended by a security guard, leading to an intense physical confrontation. Despite Chris's background as a special forces soldier, he struggles to overpower the security officer. The fight ends with Chris being incapacitated by a stun device. Booth, the head of casino security, takes Chris and his friends for torture. Booth is excited to see someone resembling a special forces soldier. He uses a necklace and cutter to harm Chris, who is helpless and injured, covered in wounds. Chris ends up on the road, but luckily, a truck driver stops to help and takes him to the hospital. The treating doctor reveals that whoever harmed Chris intended to kill him. Fortunately, Chris's strong body ensures he'll be okay, unlike an ordinary person who might not survive such an attack. After a few days in the hospital, Chris is allowed to go home, accompanied by Ray. However, his movement is limited as his stitches are still fresh. With time, Chris's health improves, and he can resume regular activities. One day, Jay visits Chris's house to sincerely apologize for his employees' actions. He mentions firing the cheater and reprimanding the security officer. Despite Jay's efforts, Chris, still upset, doesn't really care. Jay then offers Chris a job as the head of security at his casino with a significant amount of money. Driven by emotions, Chris declines. Instead, he decides to go to the police station to report the incident from the previous day. Sheriff Watkins turns him down, claiming the case is closed. The sheriff also warns Chris that he's fortunate not to be sued by the casino for causing trouble. This only intensifies Chris's frustration, and he can't believe what's happening in his city. He informs the sheriff that he won't let things continue like this and leaves. The next day, Chris learns that Pete has taken too many drugs at a friend's house. Without wasting time, he rushes to the scene. Upon arrival, Chris asks Pete where he got the drugs, and Pete reveals it was from the casino security guard. This upsets Chris, prompting him to go home to retrieve a weapon. Later, at the casino, Chris arrives without using his weapon, left in the car, and opts for a wooden block instead. Soon after entering, Chris causes chaos, knocking out security officers, with one having his arm broken. Frustrated with Booth, who had hurt him earlier, Chris leaves the casino. However, on his way out, the police chase and arrest him. In court, where Chris's fate is decided, the casino testifies first, portraying themselves as innocent victims and trying to blame Chris for everything. Chris, dissatisfied with his lawyer's assistance, speaks up when defending himself. In front of everyone, including prosecutors, the judge, and the audience, Chris truthfully recounts the events. He also shares his plan. If found not guilty, he'll apply to become the sheriff, aiming to improve the troubled city. Chris displays the injuries inflicted by casino security officers to the prosecutor and the audience. After careful consideration, the prosecutor declares Chris not guilty and announces he will become the sheriff next term. In his role as sheriff, Chris patrols the town and encounters Jay. Requesting Jay's driver's license and vehicle registration, Jay, harboring a grudge, brings up Chris's past as a failed soldier, fueling Chris's anger. Back at the office, Sheriff Watkins suggests to Chris that he should consider appointing his friends as deputies, citing their commendable performance. Chris, however, reveals that they have all been fired, leaving the office empty and the deputies without jobs. Faced with an increased workload and needing assistance, Chris encounters Ray. Despite Ray's criminal background, Chris sees potential in him and decides to appoint him as his deputy. Their first crucial task is to halt the drug problem in their city. Chris seeks Ray's help because Ray knows who the drug dealer is in town. After investigating, all signs point to Booth as the suspected drug dealer. Ray checks Booth, finding drugs hidden in his socks. As Booth denies having more drugs elsewhere, Ray decides to search Booth's car at a repair shop. Without hesitation, Ray and Chris thoroughly inspect Booth's car, finding no additional drugs. Booth becomes upset as his car is searched and warns Chris and Ray of potential revenge from his friends. Unfazed, Chris dismisses Booth's threats, confidently stating he isn't scared. Booth is eventually taken to the police station for custody in the hope of extracting information. However, Chris is concerned about his family, asking Ray to look after them. Chris decides to stay at the office overnight to keep an eye on Booth. Shortly after Ray leaves, Dana arrives with some food. The next day, after checking on Booth, Chris's patrol car suddenly explodes. Shocked, he realizes Jay's men and friends are responsible for the explosion. They also start shooting at Chris's office without concern for Booth being inside. Under pressure, Chris forcibly enters his own office to rescue Booth. He goes to Booth, who's in custody, and Booth convinces Chris to open his cell. Booth reveals that the drugs came from Jay, produced in his closed factory. Just as Chris is about to open the cell, Booth is unexpectedly shot by one of his own friends. In a sudden turn of events, Chris arrives at the scene and gets caught up in the chaos, leading to a physical confrontation with Ray. Prioritizing his family's safety, Chris takes immediate action to ensure their well-being before delving deeper into the situation. Inside, he is confronted by Jay and unwittingly falls into a trap set by him, narrowly escaping serious injury. In a desperate struggle, Chris manages to drag Jay down with him, resulting in both of them falling from a height. The fall leaves Chris with a sprained leg. Despite his injury, Chris is forced to flee into the forest with Jay in hot pursuit, marking the beginning of a grueling fight between the two. Exhausted and relying on their residual strength, they engage in a fierce battle in the forest. In a stroke of fortune, Chris finds some wooden blocks, which he resourcefully uses as his primary weapon. Even as Jay wields an axe, Chris is able to outmaneuver and defeat him, although he sustains a leg injury in the process. Determined to see justice served, Chris insists on Jay's arrest. The movie ends with Chris and Ray overseeing the security at Jay's casino and taking the initiative to reopen the lumber factory, thereby creating job opportunities for the residents of the city. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.